Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the role of wireless in the enterprise. This is Mona Ashur with Sense of Feely, and I would like to welcome you to our first Sparring Partners webinar. With Sparring Partners, we want to make webinars more engaging, interactive, and thought-provoking. We have two debaters who will discuss a topic and answer your questions on video without slides. We also want you, as our audience members, to be actively involved. The chat window is open and available for you to use amongst yourselves. Feel free to comment on the ongoing discussion, but please keep the conversation polite and respectful. If you wish to ask any questions to the debaters, please do so through the Q&A window. They will answer the questions throughout the webinar, so do not wait until the end to submit your questions. The debaters will try to answer all of your questions, but will give priority to those that fit with the discussion thread. We will ask you to vote on polls during the webinar to get your opinion. Additionally, we may ask you off-the-cuff questions. Please use the raise your hand button on the bottom of your screen to vote. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you today's debaters, Monica Paolini, the principal of Sense of Feely, and Chris Nickel, principal of Nickel Associates.
Hey, Mona, thanks a lot for the introduction, and thank you all for calling in and listening to our first Sparring Partners. It's a pleasure, and since this is the first one, it would be great to hear your feedback as we go along and afterwards. And let me get started. And first of all, I would like to welcome Chris, that you should see on the other side of the screen. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, looking forward to it. This is going to be fun. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this morning.
And Chris and I have been, known each other, we're friends for a long time. And the kind of conversation we have today, we had many times in the past. So it's a lot of fun for us to do this. So the topic today is, we want to talk about is wireless changing the enterprise, or is the enterprise changing wireless? So before we get started, we're going to start with really a basic 101 thing. What is wireless and what is the enterprise? And since I'm going first, I'm going to take the easy one, the enterprise. So by enterprise, what we mean is the enterprise, what we clearly refer to the enterprise, but also we include all the venue owners, and basically those that have control over the venue. So it would be a mall, an airport, a stadium, but also a hospital, but not a city where you have some control, but it's not exclusive control of the real estate. And as we'll see later, real estate, it's a really important term when you talk about the enterprise. So, Chris, what about the wireless?
So on the wireless side, we're really expanded the definition. It's much more than just cellular coverage. There's been a lot of studies that have been done. Certainly CommScope's put out a few studies about the lack of indoor coverage from the outside of the network, but that's really referring to cellular service and particularly voice service. We know about Wi-Fi on the inside. So between cellular, Wi-Fi, but we also need to start thinking about IoT when we look at wireless networks and how they're impacting the business and the enterprise as well. So from a wireless perspective, it's much more than just cellular. We're going to try and touch on a wide range of topics here, but it's cellular coverage, it's Wi-Fi, it's Bluetooth, it's Zigbee, it's some other wireless technologies as well. So it is pretty comprehensive and fairly expansive when we talk about the wireless impact on the enterprise.
So what we're going to start is to ask you the question first, and then we'll see what you think to get started. So if we can get the first poll.
Yeah, this will be a good start just to see what the panelists think is, what's your opinion, which is changing which. And we want, at this point, we won't try to sway your opinion one way or the other. Not yet, anyway.
We thought we'll have you do some of the work. To make our life easier, and then we'll just comment on what you're seeing.
So certainly we're at a period of time when coverage, whether within a building, it's already been proven to add value to the real estate. So if you're a building owner, improved coverage inside, add somewhere around 30 to 35% to the value of the square footage. Now the question is, what's the cost of providing that coverage? So let's see what the audience thinks.
Actually, to that one, I had a big aha moment when I was talking to somebody about the cost. What is the cost of wireless? And so we were trying to see, is it worth it or not? And the person that I was talking to, like venue owner, he started comparing the cost of wireless to the cost of carpeting. And I think that that's really a telling thing, because that's what, when you build something new, that's part of it. And so he was comparing, he was saying basically wireless is cost less than carpeting, and it's just as important. And I think that that's really it's a different way to look at this issue.
I can't decide if it's a good thing or a bad thing that they're comparing wireless service and what it takes to provide wireless to a basic amenity like carpeting, which I tend to think enterprises tend to get pretty cheap on. And we don't want to get cheap on, providing that wireless coverage. But it's interesting that he's thinking of in terms of, we got carpeting, we've got wireless coverage, we've got, bathrooms, we've got, all sorts of different things we need to put in place. But at least they're thinking in terms of, it is the basic amenity that has to go in.
Yeah. Well, this one was a venue, so probably that it was a little bit more important. I hope they start talking about the bathrooms, you would save the bathrooms, and that's not good. we still want to have some basic amenities there. Okay, should we look at the results? There we go. Okay.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So we have 17% of the people that think that it's enterprise that is mostly changing wireless. 30% that think that wireless is mostly changing the enterprise, and then 51% it's both ways, and 1%, 2% saying both of them. Okay, Chris, what do you think?
So this is where I think what we're seeing is a realization that if you're going to provide an enterprise service, especially from a wireless type of service, the building's going to have to adjust as well. So you've got the advantage of taking some different technologies and putting them in place, not just cellular, not just Wi-Fi, but you do have to make some accommodations within the building. So with the different form factors, which we'll talk about, whether it's an access point or a femtocell or small cell, whatever, whether you're using Cat5 or fiber, Ethernet services for the backhaul and front haul, I do think that both kind of impact each other.
Yeah. And I also, when you think about technologies like LTE, they're being changed to fit in the enterprise. So the whole issue about having private networks, CBRS, or use them in unlicensed bands, you basically have the basic core technologies that changes to adapt not only to new use cases, but to new business models and deployment models. And so it's really interesting because it goes both ways, and it's to the advantage of everybody involved, because we just had that gain more flexibility in using this technology. And if you remember, like a few years ago, a lot of most of the enterprise would be just using Wi-Fi or really proprietary technology in some different bands, and that made everything much more complicated, expensive, more risky, because if your vendor goes out of business and you have a problem. So this looks much better for the enterprise, much more flexible environment.
It's flexible, but I'm concerned about the added complexity that it brings in as well. In the old days, even a few years ago, when you brought your device in and it was on one of the big mobile carriers in the mobile networks and you had Wi-Fi, you were pretty much 100% covered. Now, you probably didn't have great cellular coverage within your building, but from a data perspective, you had Wi-Fi, because pretty much every enterprise has set up some sort of Wi-Fi for the data side. But as we get into, LAA and MulteFire and private LTE and CBRS, and Zigbee and Bluetooth and, the IoT options, I'm wondering if we're not making it a little too complex for the enterprise and the building owners by having too many options, because they're all also predicated on device availability. When you talk about CBRS in particular, there's lots of questions still about the PAL licenses and how long and how big is the license going to be, how device support. So I'm concerned about some of the device availability and support for this broad range of wireless technologies that enterprises could use The question is, how quickly will they adopt it, and does it really fracture the ecosystem?
Yeah, and you raised a very important point in terms of, how do you manage the complexity? Because it's true that the more spectrum, the merrier. Sure, but at the same time, you want to keep the number of interfaces, the number of networks to a minimum, so that you don't get completely overwhelmed by the complexity of it. And so I think that for the enterprise, the big question is which ones are the best solutions? And different enterprises would answer this differently depending on what they're trying to do. So it's good that you have a choice, but you need to make sure you use your ability to choose in the proper way, and you don't get you get networks that are too complex. And device availability, as you mentioned, it's clearly an issue. And what kind of spectrum should you use? So those are all concerns that needs to be addressed. Also the complexity of the networks in themselves. So LTE, it's great. There's a lot of work that is being done, MulteFire, CBRS, and OnGo, LAA, to make them easier to deploy, so that you can do it you can deploy them in an enterprise setting. But it's also true that you need to manage those networks more carefully. It's not just putting an access point there. Now, it's also true that with Wi-Fi, you don't put an access point out there anymore. So I would say, and maybe you can get to this later, is that as the cellular technologies gets easier and easier to use in an enterprise environment, Wi-Fi is also getting more sophisticated and it looks more like cellular. So you get better performance, but you pay a price with a little bit more complexity.
Yeah, and I know about Wi-Fi kind of continues to push the envelope and become more cellular-like, and I'm wondering if that's actually such a good thing. As we move the high-performance users, the heavy video users, and the big data users off of Wi-Fi onto CBRS, potentially using LAA, using MulteFire, for example, to me, at this point, the Wi-Fi networks actually start performing better. It's kind of like what we saw on the 3G to 4G transition in the US, especially when you looked at T-Mobile when they started converting over in AT&T from HSPA to LTE. Suddenly the HSPA networks were very lightly loaded, still had sufficient backhaul, and performance skyrocketed. Delays went down and throughput went up because there was fewer users. I'm wondering if the same thing's going to happen with LTE with Wi-Fi, once we get into, potentially private LTE networks for enterprise, and by moving some of these users and applications off of the best effort Wi-Fi and onto, these other networks, which have better QoS, better security in particular. And security is an issue I think we're going to have to address as well, as we move forward. So I'm wondering, will Wi-Fi, start equaling cellular in performance and features and capabilities? I think the standards will be there, but I think adoption of the standards are going to be fairly slow because enterprises aren't going to want to manage two fairly complex networks. I mean, no enterprise is in business to manage a telecommunications network. Now I think we'll see third parties come about, service providers managing it. But for the most part, I think we'll continue to see Wi-Fi for base data connectivity, and then potentially the private networks, VPN, CBRS, MulteFire type networks set up for higher security, higher profile, type applications for the enterprise.
Yeah, I think you're right. But with the 11AX, the new next generation of Wi-Fi, there's going to be a huge change in terms of what Wi-Fi can do. But as you said, that's going to be slow. At the same time, it's also true that from an enterprise point of view, it's going to be a gradual development. So they don't need to put it's not like 5G, you either have it or you don't. With Wi-Fi, it's a gradual change. So the enterprise can just start changing, upgrade to 11AX, and then only gradually you will have the functionality because you have all the devices and all the access points on AX. But you don't need to have anybody to buy a new handset to have AX to use the network in the way that you'd have for 5G. So that's I think it's an interesting difference, but I think that, at the same time, I think that what you're saying, it's a very good point. It's a good thing to have Wi-Fi as sort of the sort of basic connectivity network. We need it. We use it a lot, and I think that that's actually the reason why we need the other networks as well, because it's a way you differentiate. You have different types of data applications within the enterprise, so you want to keep them to some extent separate.
Yeah. I mean, this might be a good time to start talking about CBRS and what's coming up with that spectrum. I've mentioned a few times, we've talked about, this wide swath of spectrum, and whether it's 3.5 globally or CBRS in the US, I think for our discussion, we'll focus primarily on the US market. But now might be a good time to just get a feel from the audience. What do you feel about CBRS? We got a couple questions here for you, actually 3. Is CBRS a game changer? Who is going to deploy it? And then when do you expect to see, the commercial deployment? So if y'all could take a few minutes, you'll need to scroll down to see the other options for the third question there. But let's get your views on CBRS. I will tell you, I'm kind of a CBRS skeptic at this point. I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be addressed. We'll get into those in just a minute. Monica, you want to give your early thoughts on CBRS?
I'll get it. Why is it whenever I talk, there's this big noise? I hope it's not me causing it. I think that I'm a little bit more optimistic, and I will get to that later. I think that it's also important, to look at CBRS in the bigger context of, what are the options. What are so for instance, now with the new it's just the think about, if Wi-Fi gets a lot of 6 gigahertz spectrum, that might, change the balance a little bit. So it's a little bit of a trade-off issue, but, 3.5 CBRS is it's a really cool experiment in how to use spectrum. So because it changed, it allows us to think of a way to use spectrum that it's already used by incumbents, to share spectrum. A lot of the spectrum is underutilized because you have one spectrum holder and licensees, and clearly that limits the use of the spectrum. That's necessary, and that's a good way to go for a lot of the spectrum bands, but it's also good to have bands where you have multiple entities using the spectrum, incumbents and so on. So for instance, in the 6 gigahertz band, we have the same problem. We have incumbents there too. And the question is, how do you deal with that so that you can use spectrum more efficiently? That to me is just something that is going to be very important. How are we doing with the,
I think the results are going to get posted here in just a minute. It'd be interesting to see. Here we go. So is CBRS a game changer? So about half the audience, 51% say yes, 21% say no, and 28% say they don't know. Okay, excellent. It's good to have opinions kind of both ways. Who's going to deploy it? So overwhelmingly, it looks like mostly the mobile operators, as well as equally the enterprise, mobile, and cable operators. A couple of naysayers say nobody's going to deploy it. And then mostly the enterprise, 15%. I do think all of the operators will potentially jump into CBRS at some point in time. I do agree with the timelines here, though. So 15% said 2019, 64% said 2020. I think that's the right time frame. And then 2010 or later, I think that was supposed to have been 2020 or later. That was probably my bad on the edit on that. So that was 11%. But yeah, I think 2020 is kind of the right time frame. The problems I have with CBRS and the challenges that I see on the GAA side, it's really going to be device support that's slowly coming up. But we know it takes anywhere from 18 to 24 months to get about 35% penetration of a new smartphone, a new device, in the market. So even if a new phone comes out today, we're still talking, we're towards the end of 2018. We're still talking late 2019, 2020 to hit about a 30 to 40% penetration of devices to use the new spectrum. And that seems to be about where operators want to be in order to launch, kind of broadly a new service, 30, 35% device penetration. And then, hopefully it'll go up from there. That's GAA. On the private side, and this is where I think the conversation is germane to our topic here, the PAL licenses still are not defined. And in talking to large enterprises and the operators themselves, we've been hearing from the FCC that they're talking about this 3-year license for the priority access license, the PAL license. For the operators, that's a non-starter because it's going to take 3 years to get the network deployed and start generating revenue. And then if they lose the license, they've lost the investment. On the enterprise side, I'm actually hearing almost exactly the same thing, that 3 years is not long enough. It's going to take them 6 months to a year to get the network in place. It's going to take a year or two to really fine tune it, get the network working, for the specific application that they want it to work for, and then suddenly they could potentially lose the license. So it seems like both enterprises and service providers want longer license terms for the PAL, which is not necessarily what the ISPs and some of the competitive carriers want. So licensing to me is a huge issue as far as advancement of CBRS in the private space. In the GAA space, certainly, I think that's going to augment, Wi-Fi potentially. You got more spectrum there, but then you're still going to run into the issues that I think we have with Wi-Fi, potentially with congestion and management, but we'll see how that goes. So let me stop there, Monica, see what you think.
So yeah, I completely agree with you in this, and I think that for PAL, we really need to, from a regulatory point of view, we really need to get moving because it's going to take a long time, in general. And here, there is a little bit more of uncertainty because it's not just you put out the spectrum for auction and you're done. For instance, just to understand how valuable that spectrum is, it's difficult because we don't know yet what the parameters are, how this is going to be used, how the secondary market, is the secondary market going to work or not. So it's very difficult, and that creates uncertainty even in people using GAA. Because the availability of GAA spectrum is contingent on who owns the PAL licenses. So, so the two actually, even though you can deploy GAA without having a PAL a license, you're still going to be affected by it. So I think that from a regulatory point of view, it's really important that we get going and moving soon. Said that, I think, and this is what I was alluding to before, in a lot of environments, enterprise environments, and venue owners, where you control the venue, the physical location, you can basically protect your investment by virtue of owning the real estate. So you can deploy under GAA, and you can continue doing that because you control who comes into your premises. And I think that this is going to be the first market to go forward. So with respect to the poll, I would be more optimistic about the enterprise getting into the market ahead. It's absolutely crucial, however, that operators will do it too, because that's where you get the devices eventually coming in. But I think that at the beginning, and this I think it's quite interesting, we're going to see a lot of enterprise or a wireless ISP type of deployments where you are not so dependent on the devices. By devices I mean a mobile phone. So if you are a wireless ISP, you have a point-to-point connection. And if you're in an enterprise, there's a lot of IoT applications that you can use CBRS for, which is good because then you're able to do this on a separate network. It's not the Wi-Fi network. For some application, that's an advantage. It's cleaner spectrum, you have more control. So there is an advantage, and the two are completely complementary. So I actually am more bullish on the GAA and enterprise in the short term. And then eventually once we have PAL, because mobile operators will start deploying, I think, CBRS or OnGo before PAL licenses, but they're going to be a little bit more careful. They need to protect their investment. And that's why we really need to act, because CBRS it's a very important experiment in how we use spectrum, and if it works for CBRS for the 3.5 band in the US, there is a lot of opportunities in other bands in the US and in other countries.
Yeah, and we've heard from, for example, Federated Wireless is talking about taking the spectrum sharing model and moving it into other bands as well. C-band and the 4 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz bands is, I think, some of the bands that they were proposing. I do agree that we may end up seeing a bifurcation, if you will, of CBRS, where you've got GAA service, and that's going to be almost like high-speed Wi-Fi, for operators and enterprises and for others. And then private networks will come in on the PAL licenses. But to your point, stadiums, and there's several thousand stadiums in the U.S., 10,000 seats and above. Smaller venues may be a little more problematic because of the density of where they are. So concert halls and play halls and in those kind of places. Good application for them because, like you said, it's very well contained. Potentially you could actually do some probably architecture work to keep the signals from outside kind of coming in and potentially contaminating your CBRS network. So I think there's some applications there. But what I don't see, from a cellular perspective, until the PAL licenses really get well defined and licenses get pushed out to 5 to maybe 7 years, that the operators start using that on the license basis. Will they use it like LAA, where they're combining LTE with Wi-Fi? Potentially they combine LTE with CBRS license to boost speeds. Potentially they could. I'm still concerned about user experience. Users don't tolerate variable experiences very well. They like it consistent. If it's consistently mediocre, then they understand that. But they don't want really good one day and then really bad the next day, because then they can't run their applications the way they're expecting to. So I'm still a little concerned about how CBRS is going to roll out in the time frame. But given the time frame we saw in the study, which I agree to, 2020 is still a year, not quite a year and a half away. Maybe a couple years away. We'll see how it actually deploys. But there is another spectrum band that we haven't really touched on yet that I think offers some huge opportunities, and that's millimeter wave. So I don't know if you have any closing comments on CBRS before we start bringing up millimeter wave and going in that direction.
Yeah, let me just have one thing is another important part that it's both both with CBRS and MulteFire is the concerted effort from the whole industry to get something that is sufficiently simple. So so what the industry is doing is to try to make those technologies available in a sort of enterprise or private network setting. And I think that this is very important aspects, because it's thinking about the access and how the same access technology can be used in different environments. So for instance, it's like the CBRS and MulteFire in a box type of approach. And I think that that's going to be really crucial to the success of the technology. Doesn't matter how good the technology is, if it's not sufficiently easy to use, it's just not, it's not going to work. So let's just go to millimeter wave.
Before you do that, actually, a couple comments came in. One is about the building codes, and especially for the first responders, the ability to have cellular coverage within the building. The building codes, as was pointed out in the chat, are actually taking quite a while to get put in place. But certainly there is a thought for the building owners that they need to provide some sort of good coverage for first responders in particular, within the building. Whether or not CBRS is going to help with that, not sure. And then there were, the cost for licensing, as we, the term, I brought up the term, but of course the costs for the CBRS PAL licenses hasn't been defined either. It was mentioned that only Ruckus is really talking about private CBRS. Actually, a number of vendors are. Maybe they're not doing it as publicly, but the companies that we've been working with, most of them, the equipment vendors, are talking about LTE in the 3.5 band and use from a private network perspective. It's still a challenge. We talk about network in a box. It's still not there after all these years, and now we're talking about a wireless network in a box, and that's even a little more complex. But this is where I think vendors like like the Nokias and the Huaweis and Affirmed and Mavenir are talking about, really from a virtualized perspective, being able to run this on a few cores, on a few servers. And so the idea that we will have private networks moving forward, I think we'll see a resurgence, but we'll get to that probably in a different discussion.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So can I just, and CBRS is kind of like we can be talking for hours, but one thing that is sort of like I almost forget. I think it's the importance of having if you use 3.5. there is no macro infrastructure there. Or there will be, it's unlikely to happen, right? So the way I see it is like, it's a great opportunity for small cells to actually take off. Because if you look at it from a enterprise point of view, if you deploy a good 3.5 network with small cells, you have good in-building coverage, and then you can have a neutral host situation where mobile operators can all share the network. Now, we've been talking about sharing the network, sharing the infrastructure with small cells for a long time. This is not going anywhere, because if you have to use licensed spectrum that it's used for the macro, at the macro level as well, every operator wants to use their own spectrum, understandably, to manage interference and all that. And what that has meant is that in an enterprise, if you want to have small cells, then you need to have small cells for each operator. That model doesn't really work very well. It's not cost effective, it's just too expensive. So I think that, CBRS, it's really a huge opportunity to actually get this in-building coverage with small cell in a cost-effective way, because for operators, it's much easier to share the infrastructure if it's not their licensed spectrum. Now, as Chris said, then we need to worry about quality of experience. Now, and that's a major issue. And I think that, moving forward, it might very well be that CBRS will be deployed using 5G, and then you have a better way to actually manage that. So you can use 3.5 or CBRS as an opportunistic addition to what you have. So if for whatever reason you want to switch to a cellular band, then you can, and then operators can use that, but still control the QoE, because that's obviously crucial.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about neutral host for a number of years, especially around small cells. Ruckus had an example, I think, where they put in a network for a resort, but because of the way the spectrum played out, they ended up putting in multiple units, kind of one for each operator on the same shared infrastructure. There's others, other manufacturers have multi-operator small cells put in place. Certainly Huawei has them. I think Nokia's got them. Airspan. I think Cass is talking about it, but they're not quite there yet. But the idea around neutral host is more than just spectrum. It has to come with the tools, the management and operations tools, so that the operators can individually see and manage the user experience for their users on the shared infrastructure. So certainly SON comes into play from a global perspective to minimize interference, especially if you're talking about kind of higher spectrum, just managing interference between the small cells or among the small cells themselves, but also getting into the analytics and being able to get down to the user. If we're talking about 5G and network slicing, now eventually 5G is going to run over 3.5G. It's going to run over 2.5. Sprint was talking about that at Mobile World Congress Americas a couple of weeks ago. We're going to see these technologies crossing multiple bands. And with network slicing come into play, now we're talking about end-to-end network slicing. We need the operations tools to kind of keep up with getting to the users and understand the user experience. Now, how does this apply to the enterprise? Starting to use, whether it's CBRS or millimeter wave, if the application is running on top of the spectrum for things like geofencing. Is the employee in a part of the building that they should be in or are allowed to be in? Or just identifying where the employees are in case of an emergency. And there's a question about, well, if we're talking about a first responder network, what role does CBRS play? Well, what we don't know yet is what are all the bands, the devices that the first responders are actually going to have, that network's, getting into place. I would suspect that they're not going to have single band devices, that, the first responders will have bands that will support the 5 gig, the 2.4, potentially 3.5, the 700 megahertz, 800 megahertz, 2.5, and so on. So it is possible to use indoor cellular systems such as CBRS, potentially, maybe millimeter wave as well, for the first responders to use for their communications. So, kind of wrapped a lot of things into that. But, getting back to millimeter wave, which I think offers a huge opportunity for the indoor coverage, but it comes with its own challenges, and not the least of which is it's very high spectrum and device support. Again, not to raise the issue over and over again, but device support is going to be a big issue.
Okay, now let me take a question from the Q&A. It's about CBRS licensing costs, if there is an update. And the answer is not really, because we don't know the rules. So I've tried to estimate the cost of the licensing, but it's really, you cannot just use historical pricing here because it's not the same. It's not, it's a very different type of license. And especially if you don't know the rules, if you don't know how long the license is, what's the size of the license, it's so we do not know, and we don't know what's the the impact of GA access in this, because obviously, if you can use it for free, how much are you willing to pay, and who is going to bid for it too? Because operators might, but it's also a potential for like neutral host or other companies. There might be a wholesale play. Somebody might buy the spectrum and then sell it in the secondary market. I mean, lease it in the secondary market. So we don't know. But let's move to millimeter wave. Otherwise, we'll never get there. Okay, new poll for you guys.
Yeah, we do have a poll for millimeter wave. Here we go. Very, very simple one, pretty easy. So, where do you think it's going to be deployed? Fixed wireless. I mean, we know about the operator, especially in the US, Verizon talking about it. Internationally, they're talking about some fixed wireless as well. Purely indoor, equally indoor, outdoor, or is this really just literally what I call dots on the map? It's just very limited, not going to be deployed widely. So I'd be interested to see what the panelists say as far as how will millimeter wave be deployed. I've got my own thoughts on that as well. I know, Monica, you do too.
I think that we're both optimistic on that. So this noise every now and then. Apologies, you guys, for the noise.
Yeah, I don't hear anything on my side from you, Monica. I was looking at Twitter earlier this week, and there's some conversations around millimeter wave, and will it be outdoors? Will it be indoors? So I'm looking forward to bringing up, kind of some of those thoughts.
The thing is that if you think about millimeter wave in the past, now millimeter wave is kind of like, it has a cool name now, but it's been around forever, and we never could figure out what to do with it because the propagation is so bad. It's just terrible, right? And this is actually the major advantage right now, because the way I see it is because it doesn't propagate well. It's just the best defense for interference. So the spectrum reuse opportunity is huge. So I think that it's really good news that you just basically use the sort of what used to be a limitation of the band to our advantage.
Yeah, and we have seen even from the vendors. So a couple of years ago at Mobile World Congress Americas, Nokia's CTO came out and was very, very cold on fixed wireless access for millimeter wave, and showed a lot of results from some of the testing and things that they have done. I think they've kind of walked back a little bit from the practical application perspective. And we're seeing some things with millimeter wave, I think, in the real world that didn't come up in the models, which would actually change, I think, some of the opportunities to deploy. So let's see the results that we have from the poll here before we continue on too much. Okay.
Okay, so let me go through this. So where will millimeter wave be deployed? Outdoors, mostly outdoors, 37%, indoor 10%, equally indoor and outdoor 22%, only niche limited deployments 31%. So we have a pretty much a split audience here, and I think that okay. So let's talk about outdoor access, which is to some extent is not really the best. The focus on the enterprise, but there will be actually there's going to be some enterprise use for that for when you have fixed links as well. But a lot of the attention right now it's on using it as a sort of a last mile broadband, fixed broadband solution. And I think that if you go through a model like the one that Chris was mentioning, when you look at does this work on a large scale? The answer is no. It's not going to replace wireline because in many cases that is cheaper, it's more efficient, more effective. So no point. But there are also environments where fixed wireless is convenient, it's cost effective. So it's not does it work or not? Is it a good business model or not? Is the question is, where is the good business model? Where are those niche environments? And how big is the niche anyway?
Yeah.
But I think that, for as far as the enterprise, indoor millimeter wave is actually, I think it's a very exciting topic. Not going to be in the next 6 months, but in the long term, I think it's going to be quite important. I don't know, Chris, you have your views.
Yeah, so I'm actually a bigger proponent of millimeter wave in the indoors, outdoors as well, and I agree with that. We'll get to that in just a second. But on the indoor side, I think the challenging propagation characteristics is actually an asset. So literally being able to set up a network that goes room to room to room instead of across, whole floors of a building, I actually think this is where an opportunity where the wireless may change the enterprise, where enterprises now start thinking in terms not of just ubiquitous network access, but if I'm providing access for a team, let me put a network in, and that network doesn't bleed over to anywhere else. So security is enhanced even without having firewalls and different types of other security mechanisms in place. The network itself is limiting, and I consider that a benefit. What we still don't know is what's going to be the cost of the small cells to deploy that type of architecture. Can I have a more distributed system, and whether it's a DAS or a distributed small cell, can I put those antennas in the rooms where I need it, but I can kind of pull back the intelligence into a more centralized architecture, or have a distributed intelligence, what's going to be the cost factor there? And of course, cost is always one of those things that's a driving factor for enterprises as they make their decisions. But I do think millimeter wave internally, again, with proper device support, really could change the way enterprises architect their network, enhance security, and enhance some of the services that they offer, much broader bandwidths. So maybe video conferencing really does become desktop to desktop and much more applicable than even we have today. I mean, we're on Zoom today here, really good. I'm on Wi-Fi myself here, private Wi-Fi on 5 gigahertz. But maybe we'll really start seeing more use of kind of face-to-face and personalized communications because they'll have the bandwidth and the ability to do so without putting in expensive infrastructure.
Well, I guess when you look at the cost, you can see that if you have like this sort of like very, very small spots of high connectivity, that basically is as an offload. So if you are an enterprise, you have your Wi-Fi or small, whatever network you have. If you have areas where you know there is a high usage and you put millimeter wave just there, you're going to get offload for the rest of the network. So there is a huge. So it's basically the same idea of small cells taking one layer down. So again, devices is a major issue, not going to be in the short term, but in the big long term. And also, there is millimeter wave, but there is also the 60 gigahertz, which I guess is still millimeter wave technically. But that's an area where we might expect devices sooner, and the cost is not going to be too high. It's going to be, Wi-Fi, but with a huge amount of spectrum, so it's unlicensed. But when you get to those high frequencies, then the interference is not much of an issue. So you can use unlicensed without having any issues in terms of interference. So I think that and as I said, this is going to change the way we deploy and think of connectivity and use it.
Yeah, even outside, I've kind of kept up with some of the technology advancements here. A couple things. We're starting to see from the ISP perspective, use of fixed wireless access, from say a monopole to an access point to replace fiber. It's much less expensive to deploy. You can actually seed a market, see how many customers you get signed up, and determine if you really need to go to fiber in the future. Because you do have the capacity, even for multiple 4K video streams on a fixed wireless access. From a campus perspective, I think it makes perfect sense. It's easy to deploy. It actually does withstand weather better than I think it was expected to. And what I'm hearing from actual trials, and this is both from operators as well as vendors, is that the signal actually bounces. So, we talk about propagation, it doesn't go through walls. In an outdoor environment, it doesn't go through the walls, it actually bounces off of them. So they're getting better performance than they were expecting, because of the fact that, the signal's not going to go through this wall, it's not going to go through this glass, but it's going to bounce and reflect off and get to an antenna from a different path than was expected. So this is a case where we may start seeing millimeter wave outdoor deployments on shorter antennas, say 3 meters, not 5 or 10 meters high, because when you're up that high, now you're getting into the trees and the foliage, some of the other interference that they can't get around. But when it's lower, you can actually bounce the signal and you get better propagation. So again, is it going to be broadly deployed? I don't think we're painting the map yellow or magenta or red or blue or whatever. I think it's going to be spots on the map, but those are going to be very important spots, where it's actually going to be deployed.
Yeah, very valuable. And yeah, the thing about, using reflection, it's very important, but it's at the same time, it's something that it's very difficult for a vendor to really market. You can't just go and say, well, you just have to write the right reflection and it will work. So it is going to be something that is going to be more ad hoc. So, and you have to really learn how to use it, because yes, you can use reflection, but things in the environment change. So how do you deal with that? So it's going to be a lot of sort of like below the radar kind of thing. So it's not going to be big press release kind of activity, but it's still nevertheless, especially for the enterprise, for a lot of links, that I think that would be very useful. Now, we don't have a huge amount of time, so maybe we can go to the next one, which is like the business model, because we talked about technology all the time, right? But who's going to pay for all this, and is that going to change? So we have another poll for you guys. And so it's about, will the enterprise pay, deploy, and operate this wireless networks in their premises? So the option is pay and deploy, pay for somebody else to do it, operators will pay, and a mix of the above. And
I love this. Operators will pay. Yeah, the other guys will pay for it, for me to use it. Sure, yeah, not a problem. Not that I have an opinion on this.
Well, I guess it'd be interesting to see who answers what. We have a matrix, what do the operators say about who will pay and everybody else. But actually, there are some, like, there are some neutral hosts, for instance, that some really want to pay for the for, say, an enterprise deployment, and some really do not want to. So even within the same type of player, you might have different opinions on how to go about it.
And I wonder if we're not creating potential for a new market here. So, for example, the towers. There were tower companies set up that actually put these towers up. Multiple operators hung their antennas off of these towers. The operators at one point were buying their own towers and putting their equipment up and then leasing it back. And now we're seeing kind of that offload. Are we going to start seeing service providers, managed service providers come into play? I'm not talking about operators, but actually service providers setting up kind of these neutral host networks, and similar to an antenna, or a tower, leasing services back to the operators so that they don't have to run that part of the network, and the neutral host operator will run it for the operator itself. Kind of like the regional operators and the smaller operators. They're operating under a license from one of the major mobile operators, but in effect they're running the network themselves. So it'll be interesting to see what our attendees think as far as who's actually going to pay for these networks. So we'll get the results here up momentarily. Oh, okay. All right, so a few think pay, the enterprise themselves will pay and deploy. So that kind of goes against my thinking that, no enterprise wants to operate a network for the sheer joy and pleasure of doing it. A few people think that that's probably the case. Service providers or managed service, 36%, I think that's pretty good. Operators will pay, not as much in a mix. So people taking the easy way out and saying, yeah, we're not sure, it could be anything, which I think is probably that answer. And you're probably right. Until we get pricing models and we understand what the business case is for this, we're not sure who's actually going to end up paying.
Yeah, I think if you look at it, however, which I think it's an encouraging sign, is that there is a realization that the enterprise will pay. Now, it'll be interesting to see what the enterprise says on this, because I think that most of the people on the webinar are not enterprises or wireless people. So is it wishful thinking that the enterprise will pay? And, when I talk to the enterprise, sometimes I actually get the sort of like the other extreme answer, they demand to pay. And the reason for that is that if you pay for something, you decide what kind of coverage, what kind of capacity you have, how to do the network. You can demand visibility and control over the network. And for the enterprises, this is really crucial. They want to know what they're getting. So they don't want to have an operator that, say, comes in, even if they're willing to pay, puts a few small cells here and there, and then, yeah, it is a little bit better, but it's not really what they need. So from their point of view, paying for the infrastructure is a way to ensure that they get what they want. And so, but at the same time, from an operator point of view, if they need to then have that part of the infrastructure somehow on their network, because they need to have connectivity, there is a need for the operators to understand and to see what's the best way to manage that, or how to get access onto that network. Even if it's not their network, but what kind of control and what kind of visibility they have on the network. Because true, the enterprise might own the network, might run it, or have somebody else run it, so a neutral host or whatever, but the operator does not run the network. How can they get comfortable in getting into that kind of, what is the arrangement? And I think that, we have the tools to do that, but we don't have the experience yet, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done on both ends.
So this is where I think small enterprises actually have an advantage over big enterprises. We've seen this with Sprint. We're seeing this with T-Mobile as well. I think AT&T is doing it in Verizon. But what I'm talking about here is the enterprise femto, or the small cell femto. So for Sprint, it's that magic box by Airspan. With T-Mobile, it seems to be Nokia femto cells. And we're talking about not tens of thousands of units, but hundreds of thousands of units. So if you need better indoor coverage and you're an enterprise, you go to your provider and you say, I need a small cell, I need a femto cell, or I need better indoor coverage, and they send you a magic box, or they send you a femto cell. The larger enterprises have a much more complex issue to try to deal with. It's who, if they're providing cellular service, they're paying for service for their employees, it's who did they sign up, and do they have multiple operators? If it's one or two operators, then setting up a network to improve coverage for their operator of choice, that decision's kind of made. Now, if they change operators, after a few years, they move from T-Mobile to Verizon, very different, spectrum bands here. It's not like you can repurpose, the T-Mobile equipment to run Verizon service over. So that becomes more of an issue. So I think for the smaller operators, smaller enterprises, being able to put a small femto cell in or magic box, it's plug and play, you get better coverage, away you go kind of thing. And you're good for up to probably 20, maybe 50 employees. If you have a larger building, then you put several units in and you're good to go. But the large campuses, the large enterprises, the high-rise office buildings, that's where I think you've got a real problem that the industry is still trying to address, as far as neutral host and indoor coverage, and what's the best way of doing it, and who's going to pay for it. I mean, it's one thing to have the infrastructure, fiber or the Ethernet, the Cat5, Cat6 Ethernet. It's another thing to actually have the network set up so that now you've got the agreements with the operators to run the licenses and the spectrum and what you're doing there. So this is where I think it's almost an easier problem for small businesses to solve than large.
Yeah, and there is actually a question in the about shouldn't mobile operators come in and do this also? And I think that you answered this question, and I think
I saw that question before I answered, so I was trying to wrap that in there.
Yeah, and so I think that's where the answer of the audience, like it's going to be a mix, and I think it's important to have this kind of solutions to address the sort of the small enterprise, small and medium enterprise, because that's the market that traditionally has been underserved, and so you need to have a very, very simple solutions, and as you say, they can pick and choose. They can even get multiple operators, because if the equipment is sufficiently cheap and it's easy to install, that's not really in terms of the overall expenses that they have, it's not that it's
so one of the questions came in about roaming, and with about 80% of traffic really being generated indoors, there's actually a very small percentage of traffic that moves from indoor to outdoors or outdoor to indoors. I don't think roaming is nearly as much of an issue as maybe some people might think it's going to be. I think it's much more the indoor coverage is the issue. So that actually removes, I think, somewhat a level of complexity. I mean, we've all had a situation, you walk in the building, your call drops, you reconnect once you get in, or going, hop into an elevator or something. I think humans have adjusted their behavior to kind of expect those kind of things. Do we need 5 nines reliability that when I walk into a building, I don't drop my phone call? No. We just hit the send button again and keep going.
No, you're right. And actually, the whole concept of reliability changes because, first of all, if it's data, you hardly notice unless you're doing video. And if you're doing video and you're walking, then you might have some other issues anyway. So usually when you do video, you're stationary, so it's not so much of an issue. We don't do a whole lot of voice anywhere. And then again, as you said, if the call drops, as long as you get reconnected. But that sort of casts a whole general issue that what is reliability in such environment? So the way we define, how important the dropped call number is. And it's true, it's important. You don't want to be dropping calls all the time, but sometimes it happens. It's not really as bad. It's much better if you have indoor coverage than not having a drop call. So it's not like you want to have indoor coverage, much more important than having a low drop call number in that respect. I mean, within reason, obviously. So that's, we only have 2 minutes left. So should we go for the very last?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do the quick wrap up here. The last poll.
So now we are asking you the same question to see whether there is any change throughout the hour, if we sway your mind, your opinion on that. So it's the same as before. And when we're going to have a couple of concluding remarks about, and I guess we're both sort of like, either way. But maybe we should see better. Is it more wireless or more enterprise changing?
I actually did see, just you're talking about you're not doing video, you're outside. I was in London over by the British Museum. It was kind of the evening, and I saw a guy talking using FaceTime on a tablet, not even a smartphone, but a tablet, hold up in front of his face. And he walked right into a guy wire that was holding up one of the light poles. And I thought, that's why you don't do video on the move, the whole FaceTime thing and everything. It's just like, just don't want to do that.
No.
All right, let's see what the results
we're getting used to this. So anyway, results. The results are in. Actually, I don't remember what was at the beginning. But do you remember, Chris? I think we got more people on the boat.
I think we got more people on the boat as well.
So we have 9% think that the enterprise is mostly changing wireless, 16% that wireless is mostly changing the enterprise, and 71% thinking that they're gonna change each other.
Yeah, and I think that's probably true. There's still so many questions around licensing and costs of the license, but also as you were bringing up, cost of devices, cost of the access points, cost of the equipment. So cost is still a big issue that hopefully, 6 months or so, we'll have some answers, especially around CBRS and device availability. So.
Yeah, and my parting point is that we didn't ask about changing the operators, but I think that, the wireless and the enterprise change is also going to change the role of the operators. Are the operators going away? No, I mean, their role is still absolutely crucial and important, but there is going to be more of the need to work with the enterprise. And that is going to change to some extent the way they operate.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, the operators are here to stay. They provide that connectivity fabric between all the sites. But the business models are going to have to change for the operators to recognize you probably are going to see more private cellular networks, private LTE, private 5G as well. And they need to figure out a way to make all of that work. So completely agree.
I think that we are at the hour, so I would like to thank all of you guys for participating.
Thank you much.
Thank you again for joining us today. This Sparring Partners webinar will be available on demand on sensafiliconsulting.com, and we will email instructions to access it to all registrants shortly. Because this is the first Sparring Partners webinar, we would like to hear from you on your thoughts on the format of the webinar. Please feel free to reach out with your feedback. Thanks for joining.